had a ball game last night, a high school ball game, and some places around Huntsville, they won't let you in there without a mask on. Put it on, walked into the gym. I looked around and there was 2 or 3 had masks and there 12, 15 didn't. And that girl sitting at the desk said, "You don't have to wear that thing." So we pulled the mask off and there wasn't anybody in that whole gym had a mask on, hardly. And I'm sitting here wondering now, what in the world? No social distancing, no mask, nothing. And I don't know how everybody feels about the mask, but I think that the mask thing is just a bunch of stuff. But be that it may, you do it to try to accommodate, but that's just my feeling. You know what? I have yet to figure out. I understand that you put a mask on, that it'll capture the saliva or whatever. But they for a long time they sat and told us, and I sat in there, and I'm not the brightest tool in the shed, and I don't need any comments about it. But when they sitting and tell me that you can wear a mask, it won't keep you from getting it, but it'll keep you from spreading it. The coronavirus is a germ. And how in the world can a germ get into me with a mask, but it can't get out? I mean, I just don't understand that. That just don't register with me. And so it's, I'll just be glad when it's done. I'll be glad when it's over with, so things will kind of get back to normal. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight is wisdom. That's a good lead into it, wasn't it? Oh, man. Anyway, before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer. And I want to ask Marvin, if he would please, to lead us and direct our minds. We're going to be discussing the verses about verse 5 through about verse 8 in regard to the question of wisdom. Because what he says in verse 5 is that if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord, because, for a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. The word wisdom is used in the book 4 different times. It's used here in James 1 verse 5. It's also used in James 3 and verse 13. Because he said, who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? I would encourage you to notice the connection between wisdom and knowledge. And let him show out of a good conversation or the way he lives, his works with meekness and wisdom. You'll also find in verse 15 and also through verse 17. If you go back up to verse 13 or verse 14, he said, but, contrast, if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not one against another, or not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, for where envying and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. But the wisdom which is from above, he says, is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of the righteous, or righteousness, is sown in peace of them that make peace. When you look up the word wisdom, and you can ask different people about wisdom, what does it mean? And the general definition you'll get is the proper use of knowledge. But you have to take into account some things that are implied in that. Number one, what kind of knowledge? What kind of knowledge are you talking about? Because there's a variety of different kinds of knowledge. There's knowledge of business dealings. There is knowledge of astronomy. There's all kind of knowledge. What knowledge are you talking about? But then there is another thing that's implied in that. When you say the proper use of knowledge, you're making knowledge absolute and not relative. Because if knowledge was relative, then it would just be whatever that you perceive to be right and your own interpretation of the use of it. Number one, you must be referring to a specific knowledge, biblically speaking, and that it is an absolute knowledge. And it's because of the way you're acting in regard to certain things. So he is referring to a specific kind of wisdom. It's the kind of that is rooted in divine instruction, which is absolute, that directs and governs the lives of those that are committed to it. So that's the wisdom under consideration. But how in the Bible, when you look up the word Sophia, from which the word wisdom comes, it's generally defined as a broad and full intelligence. And so when you think about a broad and full intelligence, when you look through the Bible at the word wisdom, you will find a direct connection between wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. When you have a good knowledge of what the will of God is, and you understand what is involved, then you become wise. And so wisdom is actually listening to instruction, guided by God to live a certain way. That's wisdom. Seeing things the way God sees them, thinking of things the way God thinks of them, feeling about things the way God feels about them, living the way God directs. So if you want to see wisdom in shoes, look at Jesus. I mean, if you really want to understand and see wisdom in action, just look at Jesus. When Jesus was tempted of the devil in Matthew 4, 1-11, how did Jesus counteract the temptations that the devil placed before him? What did he use to counteract that? The scriptures. When the devil put before Jesus, well, if you're the Son of God, turn these stones to bread. And Jesus says, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone. Constantly referring to it is written, it is written, it is written. Wisdom, that's where our wisdom comes from. But in the Bible, it's used in a lot of different ways. And I'm just going to give you a couple of them if you don't mind. For example, in verse 3, it refers to the wisdom of having technical skills in building something. Verse 13 is talking about having wisdom in military strategy. When you talk about Luke 16 and verse 8, he talks about that the men of this world is wiser than the children of light, evidently with their dealings. When you look at 1 Kings 3, 16-25, you remember when Solomon, I believe it's 1 Kings 3, where that the two women were struggling over the infant. And Solomon, by knowing and being wise in regard to human nature, knew who to find out who the real mother was. And he said, you divide the child, give one woman one part, one another. And the mother said, being the mother, said, let her have the child. I don't want it killed. And Solomon knew right then, based on the nature of a mother, who the real mother was. Can have a broad spectrum of meanings based on the context under consideration. What I'd like to do in verses 5-8 is for us to observe really 4 main points. Number 1 is this: to be truly wise, you have to recognize the source, that it comes from God. Number 2, you have to recognize that you will not be truly wise in and of yourself. You have to ask God for it. The third thing is when you petition God for wisdom, have the faith that God will provide it, because it says it will be given you. Then the fourth thing to take into account is that when you pray to God, don't be double-minded, be confident. And every one of these things, I believe, are in the verses 5-8. Look, if you would, at verse 5 when he said, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. Well, now here's the question. It from God. Why would you ask God anything if you didn't think you would get it from him? And then in the very next statement, he says, and it shall be given him. So the first consideration is to realize that that true wisdom, the wisdom that we really need, comes from only one source. That's from God. If you'll notice in Job 32 and verse 8, it talks about the fact that of the Almighty gives understanding. Now notice what Job said in Job 32. Now Job is a suffering individual. Look at what he's lost, what he's encountering. His health is basically gone. All of his friends are gone. His wife's turned against him. His children, he's had to bury all 10 of them. He doesn't have a dime to his name anymore. And yet Job, in Job 32, or rather Job 32 and verse 8, this is Elihu's being angry, and he makes this comment, not Job, but Elihu makes this comment, and he's right in what he says. He says, there is a spirit, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth understanding. An understanding to the heart. Who can number the clouds in wisdom? Groweth into hardness, and the clods cleave fast together. Wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetite of the young lions? What God is doing is overwhelming Job with his wisdom. Job couldn't answer him. But the important thing to keep in mind, he says, Job, and this is not a question of information. It is a rhetorical question which implied in the answer. He says, who hath put wisdom in the inward parts? Job, who gave you wisdom? Where did men get their wisdom? From themselves? No. The wisdom you have came from someone who is wise. Look at Psalms 32 and verse 8. Because in Psalms chapter 32, there's an emphasis made right here upon the idea of wisdom. In verse 7, he says, thou art my hiding place. Thou shalt preserve me from trouble. Thou shalt compass me about with songs of deliverance. I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eyes. You know what wisdom you and teach you in the way you should go. Now here is a question that would come up. Now, if this be true, and it is, and the world lies in wickedness, and it does the world live in true wisdom or foolishness? You see, there is a difference in living in a world of fantasy and a world of reality. There is a difference in living in a world of make-believe and a world of realism. We don't like to hear about things that are real. For example, you sit down and try to talk to your children about that you will sooner or later leave this world and they're going to have to deal with certain things. They don't want to hear it. In their mind, they think you're going to be here forever. We sometimes, life is made up of things we can possess. Is that really wisdom? Do we not really realize that sooner or later that every single solitary thing that we possess is going to belong to somebody else for them to enjoy, for them to benefit from? Where is true wisdom in understanding the realities of life? I can remember as a kid, I had a sense of insecurity. And I remember before going to sleep at night, very often I would call out to my father or my mother, and I would say, "Are y'all going to be all right?" And I remember them saying, "Yes, we're going to be just fine." And so, but facing reality sometimes is a very, very difficult thing. But wisdom and understanding forces you face to face with facing the reality of things. I want you to look at Proverbs chapter 2. Proverbs chapter 2. And we begin with about verse 5. He says, "Then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord giveth wisdom out of his mouth." The Lord gives wisdom out of his mouth. Or gives wisdom. And out of his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. When do you have wisdom? When you have knowledge and understanding. Where does that come from? The mouth of God. Well, if it is the case then that wisdom is when you have knowledge and understanding come from the mouth of God, then it must be the case that wisdom comes from the very mouth of God. He says in verse 7, "He layeth up sound wisdom for the righteous. He's a buckler to them that walk uprightly." Well, now let me see. God gives knowledge and understanding. That's right. And he gives wisdom. That's right. And that wisdom is rooted in knowledge and understanding. That's right. And what does that? That's wisdom. How you walk or how you live dictates whether you're foolish or wise. Look at Proverbs 28 and verse 5. He says here that evil men understand not judgment, but they that seek the Lord understand all things. Let me ask you this. Since you've been a Christian, do you have a different perspective on life? Do you have a different perspective about death? Dangers they never saw before. They see pitfalls they never perceived before. They will see the value of service. Their entire perspective about things changes. So wisdom comes from God. If we want to be wise, we have got to listen to what God has to say. But now here's another thing. Fear of God is where wisdom begins. Now let me ask you this. What does fear indicate? Now, it's used in two senses, depending on your context. It can refer to reverence, respect, or it can refer to a literal fear of what God's able to do. When you look at Hebrews 12:28, what does it say? That we're to serve God how? With what? And what else? Reverence and godly fear. Now, he used both words in that text. He's not saying, let us serve God with reverence. That's redundancy. He's using it in its two distinct senses. Let us serve God with a, you know what wisdom does? It not only recognizes the blessings of God, it recognizes the wrath of God. So when somebody takes the word fear and tries to restrict it to where that its primary and only use is reverence, that is a misapplication of the word fear. It can refer to reverence, but it can also refer to literal fear of who God is and what he can do. Let me ask you this. When a person walks in defiance of God, should they simply reverence God or should they fear what they're going to face? I don't mean this disrespectful, but the reason people today react toward God the way they do in and out of the church is the very same reason that exists among the Romans in Romans 1 when they did not have the fear of God in their hearts. People need to be made to fear the God they're going to face if their lives are not right. And so to fear God is the beginning of wisdom. Go back to the book of Job. I believe it's chapter 28. I know it is, chapter 28. And look at verse 28. Larry, what does it say? Have you got it? Now, I want you to notice something here. What do you think? Fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from what? Is understanding. What kind of fear you think he's got in mind right here? Reverence God? Yes, but what other kind? Is it just that, or is it referring that if you continue to walk in the evil that you're doing, you're going to face the consequences? Let me ask you a question. In studying the prophets, I'm talking about the major prophets and the minor prophets, what did those prophets try to instill in Israel? And it was two different things in Israel regarding God. Number one, he was trying to call them to repentance. Look what God has done. Look the goodness of God. You need to respect him and honor him. But the second thing he did was put fear in their hearts when he said, here's what God's fixing to do to you. If you don't get your act together, this is what God's fixing to do to you. You look at Psalms 110, verse 1. Steve, you have Psalm 110, verse 1. All right. Now, that was verse 10, right? Or did you read verse 1? All right, read verse 10 for me. Now, Psalm 111 and verse 10. I want you to notice what he emphasizes here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's where it starts. But then he comes right down and says, and good understanding, who has that? Those that keep it. Is that not what he said? How do you know a man has good understanding? How do you know that a man is wise? Because of his fear for God. Look at Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Darrell, would you read that in for me, please? Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Well, now you've got a real contrast right here. Who does he say, or what does he say is the beginning of knowledge? Fear of the Lord. But he said, how do you know when they won't listen to correction, turn a deaf ear to what's been said, when what they're saying is biblically sound and true? They're acting foolish. Look at Proverbs chapter 9. Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 10. I'm going to go ahead and let some of you read. Jason, would you read that? Proverbs chapter 9 and about verse 10. Now, where are you reading? I want you to notice what he emphasizes here. In verse 10, he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But then he comes right back to the holy here. Who do you think that is? Yeah, it's not us. The word of the holy is understanding. You see, seeing things the way God sees them, understanding things the way God understands them. That's where wisdom comes from. So when you go back to James 1 and you say, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. Where does wisdom come from? From the mouth of God. It ought to be sought after. I mean, it ought to be pursued. Look at Proverbs chapter 4. You read this one, Proverbs chapter 4, verses 5 through 7. Okay. Let me ask you a simple question. Can a person be wise and not have understanding? Can he have understanding without having a knowledge? You stop and think about it, because if there's any one thing that is clear in every single passage almost about wisdom, is that wisdom, knowledge, and understanding are connected. The three links in the same chain. And there's no way around it. You go back to Proverbs 2. And look at verses 3 to 12. And to ask you to read for me. Do you mind? All right. Verses 3 through 12, if you don't care. What three things did you find in this again? Knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. To you, he's going to be a buckler to you. And the word buckler means a shield, a protector. Yep, that's true. Look at Proverbs 23:23. What does Proverbs 23:23 say? Keith, you have that? 23 and verse 23. Huh? Okay. Did you find it? Verse 23. No, that's the wrong one. Chapter 23, Proverbs 23 and verse 23. Now notice what you've got: truth, wisdom, instruction, and understanding. So you got a truth that you need to be instructed in, and it gives you understanding, and it makes you wise. It's just that simple. Look at Ephesians chapter 5 in the New Testament. Mr. AC, would you read this one? Ephesians 5, verses 15 through 17. I want you to notice some things he says right here that's interesting. He says, see that you walk circumspectly. What does that mean? It means the same thing as rightly or upright. As fools, but as wise. So can you determine whether a person is foolish? You can. He goes in the very next. And then verse 6, he talks about our speech, doesn't he? What does he say there? Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how to answer every man and walk in wisdom. By walking circumspectly. And how does he walk circumspectly? By walking uprightly. And how does he walk uprightly? By understanding what the will of God for your life is and living it. Isn't that wisdom? Class, isn't that wisdom? Proverbs 3:13 says, the man that finds wisdom and the man that gets understanding is a happy man. You know why? Because it helps him when he has this not to have to live with some of those mistakes he's made. So one thing to do regarding the wisdom in James chapter 1 and verse 5 is to realize that it comes from God and what it entails and what it involves. The wisdom that comes from God is instructional. It comes from the very mouth of God. It involves understanding and knowledge. It controls, dictates how you talk, how you think, how you live, how you act and interact. It controls everything about you. And because of that, it should be pursued more than anything else. A second thing, very quickly, and I'm going to have to go through this pretty quick, and forgive me for doing this. But number one, if you want to be wise, ask God for help. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. Ask him. Chronicles chapter 1, verse 10 and 1 Kings 10, 23 and 24. You remember what Solomon prayed for when he was going to be king over Israel? For wisdom. That's right. For wisdom. For wisdom. In Psalm chapter 90, verse 12, when he talks about in verse 10, that the days of our years are 70. If by reason of strength we live to be 80, then there's still the idea of labor and sorrow, and we soon fly away, he emphasizes. But in verse 12, he said, Lord, teach us to number our days and apply our hearts to wisdom. Well, now, Solomon, what in the world, or the psalmist rather, what in the world do you mean, teach us to number our days? Realize you're not going to live forever. Well, realizing that I'm not going to live forever, what do I need to do? Wisdom. I need to live right. This is one thing that the world as a whole don't do. You do. You are Christians. You realize I'm not going to live forever. I'm living the Christian life because I realize that my time is going to come when I'm going to cease to live in this world, and eternity is what's coming back. So, Lord, help me to number my days and help me to apply my heart to wisdom. Help me to be wise in the way I live. Proverbs 2 said, if you cry after wisdom or knowledge, then lift up your voice for understanding. In Ephesians 1:17, we should realize that God, and ask God to give us the spirit of wisdom and of revelation and the knowledge of him. We ought to have confidence in our prayers, even when we ask for wisdom. When we open our Bibles sometimes and we go to study and read and try to learn, How many times do we bow our heads and say, Lord, would you please give me some wisdom? Help me understand what your will is. Grant me the ability to handle it right and to rightly divide it. You want me to tell you, and I'm fessing up to my what I've given my life to. You know, one of the biggest mistakes preachers sometimes make? They spend most of their time, all their time, trying to get ready for Bible classes and sermons and spend very little time in personal use of the Word of God for themselves. I don't care who the preacher is, and I don't care who the Bible school teacher is or anyone else. The first person that ought to learn from your study is you. The third thing to keep in mind is this. When you ask of God, ask in faith. I'm talking about an unwavering faith. Because I want you to notice what James says in this regard, and we're going to close the class very quickly. Because what he says is, let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. The word wavering comes from a word which means doubting. You see the word double-minded? The word double-minded denotes the idea of uncertainty or divided in interest. Unwavering faith. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Psalms 10:17 promises the Lord listens to our prayers. Won't you listen to Isaiah chapter 58? Because I think it's an interesting statement that Isaiah makes in Isaiah 58 regarding prayer. Mark, would you mind reading that for me? I believe it's Isaiah 58:9. Yeah. Did you notice what he said? He said, if you call, the Lord's going to answer. If you cry unto him, he's going to say, here I am. Have we really thought about the fact that when we approach God, God is saying, I'm listening, here I am. I'm listening, here I am. Psalms 55:17, evening, morning, and noon will I pray and cry aloud, and he'll hear my voice. The fourth thing that I'd like for you to notice, he said we are to pray in faith, which means we're to pray with the utmost confidence. Not double-minded, not a divided interest. Do you remember what it was that caused Peter to sink in the sea in Matthew 14? It was his doubt, his failing faith. Remember what Mark 4 and verse 40 says, when the sea was tempestuous and the disciples woke the Lord up, they was concerned, and the Lord said, how is it that you have no faith. So we should have complete confidence in our Heavenly Father, listening to us, because in 1 John 5:14 and 15, this is the confidence that we have in Him, that we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. John 15:7, if you abide in me and my word abides in you, then whatsoever you ask, He'll do it. 1 John 3:22, whatsoever we ask, we receive of Him because we keep His commandments. James 5:16, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. In regard to wisdom, in James chapter 1, he said, I want you to realize it comes from God. I want you to realize that if you want it, ask God. Number 3, if you ask God, believe He'll give it to you. And number 4, be so confident that you're unwavering and you're not double-minded when you ask Him. To the best of my understanding, that's what the wisdom of James 1 is dealing with. A wisdom that comes from the mouth of God, is given instructionally. It provides knowledge and understanding. It directs the way you live, the way you talk, the way you think. You see everything from an entirely different perspective. You think about things in an entirely different way. You even feel about things entirely differently. You try to see through God's eyes, have God's feelings, gain God's understanding to have divine wisdom. That's what I understand James 1:5 entails. I want to thank you for supporting the class this year. I am sorry that things were so disruptive and things were out of sort like they were. And just pray that things will be better for this next year. Hopefully and prayerfully they will. And I really appreciate all of you supporting this class. I really do. Are there any questions or comments, please?